Professor Nancy Odendaal is a director of the School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics at the University of Cape Town, and she has an extensive body of work situated in 3 areas of research: spatial planning, planning education, and urban infrastructure. Her current work focuses on infrastructure and spatial changing in the cities of the Global South. Nancy's extensive groundbreaking work at the intersection of digital technologies, planning, and the everyday in the African context and beyond inspires also us to go beyond the materialities of the smart city to understand how digital technologies and infrastructures are contextually and relationally connected to livelihoods. Her post-colonial lens on smart city unveils not only specific forms of power that are enacted in and through smart city projects and imaginaries, but also on how what she calls homegrown digital disruptions allows for disruptive urbanisms, which is the title of her new book that's coming soon with Bristol University Press. Today, Nancy will give us a talk with the title Moving at the Speed of Trust, Data Strategies of 2 Civil Society Organizations in Cape Town, South Africa. Let's please warmly welcome Professor Odendaal.
Right, good morning everybody, and Lorena, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you also to the organizers for making this happen, and last minute changes to flights, etc. that had to happen because of a COVID diagnosis 2 weeks ago. So my talk today is entitled Moving at the Speed of Trust, and it is about the data strategies of 2 civil society organizations in Cape Town. And it is indeed based on 2 chapters of my forthcoming book with Bristol University Press, entitled Disrupted Urbanism. And really what the book is that very unique opportunity to consolidate a sort of body of work that I've developed, I would say, over the last 15 years or so, where I challenge how this African smart city is problematized, imagined, conceptualized, and explore what constitutes smart urbanism in African urban spaces with an emphasis on platforms. And a large part of this work is really about contradictions. A large part of what I do is essentially surfacing the kind of problematic tensions between how the smart city is conceptualized as a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to urban issues in African cities in the context that I work, and what the actual real city looks like and feels like, and how it operates and how it functions. And a big part of my work also is about sort of scratching the surfaces of the everyday in African cities, and how technologies or digital tools are appropriated and are kind of as part of the everyday. And indeed the book is structured or scaffolded around 4 substantive themes that essentially ask the question, if the smart city promises to deliver so much, does it actually get to the crux of what is wrong with many cities in the global south, in fact, or globally? So one chapter looks at mobility, another one looks at public culture, another one looks at food security, and a 4th one looks at civic activism, which is largely what informs the talk today. And what I do in the book is I essentially sort of tell stories. I look at vignettes of how technologies are indeed appropriated as part of the everyday in Kampala, Nairobi, Freetown in Sierra Leone, Lagos, and Cape Town, which is the geographic context of my talk today. So the last Beyond Smart Cities conference, Maria Kaika was one of the keynote speakers, and I must confess to being a terrible fangirl. And she published an article in 2017, just as the new urban agenda and the sustainable development goals were being promoted. And she talks about how we need to kind of rather embrace a politics of dissensus, where we try and kind of understand what is going on in the contemporary city. And she talks about also, I think, she also talks about contradictions. She talks about what I believe is often at the crux of the disjuncture between policy making and urban realities, a representation and application of data that's ignorant of the nuances of place. So I've presented on some of this work before, the two civil society organizations that I will be looking at, where I juxtapose the evidence-driven urban policy interventions in South African municipalities with civil society actions and activities. So essentially, the question that I'm hoping to answer with this work follows on from a lot of the work that Rob and others have done looking at data. And sort of to follow on from the question on algorithmic governance and sort of recognizing that indicators are indeed assemblages of human and inanimate agency. I mean, the question that I want to answer really is what do the platform-enabled strategies of civil society organizations that use storytelling and visual narrative to augment more traditional forms of social mobilization, what do they produce? What can they tell us about how we move beyond the smart city discourse? So my experience in having done work on this for a number of years is that often these tensions between one-size-fits-all approaches and the kind of more localized strategies of communities often surface when there's a crisis. And certainly one of the biggest crises recently is the pandemic. And I'm sort of smiling because as my glasses fog up, I'm thinking, I'm not even wearing a mask. But but it's often, it could be a dramatic climate change event, a bushfire, that surfaces the spatial manifestations of these tensions. When perhaps well-intentioned but frankly contextually clueless policy interventions that not only ignore how people live and work in the city, but tragically undermine it, sort of kind of surface and as part of the everyday. And in Cape Town, in South Africa, this happened during the pandemic in the experience of hunger by communities living in the city. So a survey done by Stats South Africa found that since the start of the hard lockdown in March 2020, hunger kind of increased to 7% in some communities, and this is kind of household hunger in particular neighborhoods. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, the layered complexities that relate to people losing jobs during the pandemic, the spatial barriers to community care that people rely on quite heavily. And one of the most salient examples relate to the sale and distribution of food in the informal economy and the importance of the informal economy in former township areas and informal areas in South African cities. Informal trade is critical to the food value chain in former South African townships and informal areas. It's a livelihood for sellers, and it's also just, it relates to people's livelihoods on a day-to-day basis with the kind of sale of small batches of food so that people can use cash on a daily basis as they earn cash on a daily basis, short-term credits, ease of access, etc. And the reason I show this example is because I think also the other tension that surfaces is the more macro tension of sort of applying a blanket response to what is essentially revealed as a spatial problem, where resources available to typical suburban areas during a time of crisis are simply not available to settlements typical of that's left on the image. So the one crisis that gave rise to the community action networks of Cape Town Together, which is the one civil society initiative that I'm looking at, is the pandemic. The other crisis that gave, well, it wasn't a crisis, it was an event that gave rise to the second example, which is Ndifuna Ukwazi, which is a civil society organization in Cape Town that deals with housing, was the sale of publicly owned land in a neighborhood in Cape Town called Sea Point. It also happens to be the neighborhood that I live in. But it's a neighborhood that's quite mixed use, it's quite medium to high income, and with the sale of publicly owned land to a private entity, there was an outrage. It sparked an outrage, focusing attention on the need for inclusionary housing in well-located areas in the city. And the reason I show this mapping is just to kind of show where you kind of see the labelling seaboard, that's essentially the centre of Cape Town, and the sort of Cape Flats is the kind of former township and informal areas of the city, and kind of shows just how not that much has shifted over the years in the 10-year period of this mapping in terms of the kind of access that people have to adequate housing in well-located areas. So the sale of this land led to a campaign called the Reclaim the City campaign, which was essentially led by the organization Ndifuna Ukwazi, which means dare to know in isiXhosa. Ndifuna Ukwazi are they're community organizers, lawyers, educators, storytellers, and researchers working around spatial injustice. And the whole point of the campaign is to stop the sale of this land to private entities and to essentially force, co-opt the city of Cape Town and the provincial government, the state government, to look at providing inclusionary housing on what is essentially quite valuable real estate. So this is the one organization that I'll be looking at. And I started doing this work in 2017 when I first started doing a kind of ethnography of the tweets that was kind of being generated by Ndifuna Ukwazi as part of the Tafelberg school campaign. And this was followed up with interviews in 2021. And also just disclosure, I was also an expert witness supporting the Tafelberg case, where I testified that the provincial and local government have failed to address spatial apartheid, which made me very popular with the city of Cape Town. So the second case that I'm looking at is, well, the first case, second case, the other case I'm looking at is Cape Town Together. It's an online network of self-organizing neighborhood level or community action networks. So it's basically, these are neighborhood responses to COVID and COVID lockdowns. I sort of started analyzing Facebook and website sort of posts in 2020 during the lockdown as this was emerging, and then did interviews with key actors in 2020 and 2021. I mean, I do just want to say something about the literature that does inspire my work and how I analyze the work of these two civil society organizations. And really, what this slide represents is a kind of intersection between two literatures that I find very useful. The one is African urbanism, so this is the work by Edgar Pieterse, Abdul Malik Simone, the late Vanessa Watson as well, I would say, where African urbanism is seen as possessing embedded qualities, and that African cities should not just be seen as incomplete versions of the ideal developed, obviously, northern or western cities. And sort of encouraging research that sort of shines a lens on the approaches and strategies employed by the diversity of stakeholders as urbanity gets kind of invented and reinvented on an ongoing basis. So quite a kind of dynamic post-structuralist perspective, I guess. And that understanding the African city requires an engagement with the everyday and everyday practices that often kind of foregrounds people as infrastructure and infrastructural strategies that are often on the make and on the go, and quite dynamic. And this is, of course, where Malik's work is very valuable, and also people like John Silver. And that there's spaces for learning and creativity that can then be uncovered through recognition of the materiality of the digital and how that interfaces with the everyday. And this is where my work comes in as a kind of extension or expansion on infrastructure studies in this context. And I can also just note someone else to look out for is Prince Guma, who does some really interesting work on this in the Kenyan context and the East African context. But I'm also obviously inspired by work on social movements, and it's a while since I've been an undergraduate student of development studies, so it's a bit rusty. But I think there's some really interesting work being done around framing techniques, storytelling as framing. There's some really interesting work on the kind of geophysical connections that are enabled through location-based media and digital storytelling. Storytelling is a cultural tool to personal, professional, and organizational development, and looking at kind of the performative aspects or functions of storytelling, and indeed the spatial self, where experiences within space and place are documented and shared, and the kind of media that enabled that in very specific contexts. And there's some wonderful work on Cuba by Kellogg, which looks at the kind of formation. It gets quite theoretical in the woods around the alternative discursive spaces that are produced through storytelling and through the kind of combination of digital and so-called analog, I guess, media, and the subversive narratives that emerge from that. But I think this quotation possibly best encapsulates my sensibility around this work, and what I find very exciting about this work that is being done by civil society organizations, obviously all over the world. I mean, in Cape Town, it does become particularly poignant, given that it's seen as one of the most unequal cities in the world. But this, just as the private pervades public spaces, the modern separation of rationality, objectivity, and cool-headed politics, on one hand, and emotion, passion, and affect on the other is reconfigured. And I think this is perhaps for me the kind of true value of excavating what these kind of storytelling techniques and these kind of digital applications could mean for sort of beyond smart cities. So I'm just going to kind of pause and talk a little bit more about these two organizations. So Ndifuna Ukwazi, they won the court case against the city of Cape Town. They stopped the sale of the Tafelberg land to private developers, and that's kind of moved, that the organization has moved its gaze to kind of the rest of Cape Town and some of the issues around housing and shelter. How storytelling is employed by Ndifuna Ukwazi is really quite interesting, and it happens on a number of levels. I mean, the first is the documentation and the telling of personal accounts that add texture and relatability to its campaigns. So this is often through a combination of new and traditional media, and it's really to not just add texture, but also to gain support. It's sort of a strategy to kind of tell stories that even your suburbanite can relate to. And then kind of garner support through these stories and through these kind of personal account. NU also uses street theatre and storytelling to make policy digestible and disseminate ideas around policies and policy mechanisms. So the idea is to storify legal and technical knowledge through on-site theatre and through Twitter serialization. And then there are these arcs that kind of are developed, and I guess this is part of the function of framing, that these kind of overarching strategic combination of media with temporal logics, where platform logics are recombined towards a kind of overarching narrative. So a kind of overarching narrative that's told through various media, and then sort of conveyed in various means as well. So the example that I have here is from Instagram, and it's essentially a storyboard. And it's a storyboard that interrogates the sort of availability of publicly owned land within the city of Cape Town's boundaries, well-located publicly owned land, owned by, for example, the military in this case, and how this land could actually go a long way towards solving Cape Town's housing crisis. So this kind of technical story that gets told with quite confrontational visual techniques to evoke an emotional response, and that's totally intentional. Big part of the intention is also to build a digital archive, knowledge production, in other words, and this is a key part of what Ndifuna Ukwazi does. And then Cape Town Together, or the CAN movement. So Cape Town Together is an umbrella organization that started in early 2020. So Cape Town Together came up with what they call the Ways of Working mandate, which is essentially a manifesto, I guess I would call it. I'm not sure how Cape Town Together would feel about me calling it a manifesto, but it's essentially a document of values that then gets adhered to, or sort of where that frames community action networks in neighbourhoods. So that your community action networks are in very particular neighbourhoods around the city of Cape Town. So each can in each neighbourhood is different, and it's entirely informed by situation and context. And the whole idea of the cans was to kind of lend a helping hand to people who are struggling during the pandemic. But what's interesting about each of the cans is that, of course, each can or each neighbourhood has a different history of activism. And some of them have quite sort of strong anti-apartheid, sort of goes back to the anti-apartheid days, street committee systems, and some of these are then combined with platforms and radio and outreach to kind of essentially enable assistance to communities within neighbourhoods. And then there's these partnerships across cans where you'll have your wealthier neighbourhoods kind of partnering with less wealthy neighbourhoods, cans, and looking at shared ways of working across varied geographic contexts. And where does technology come into it? Well, there's social media, but the WhatsApp group function was absolutely central to organizing these cans. So quite simple kind of little sort of ways of working, but in accordance with a very specific set of values that essentially drive the actions of each of the cans. So, I mean, once an urban planner, always an urban planner, I guess, but the centrality of place comes through in both these cases. The absolute, the sort of emphasis on stories that connect home and identity, and sort of creation of collective sense-making spaces that look quite different from place to place, in the can example. And yet within this kind of realm of kind of collective values, and one of those values being kind of moving at the speed of trust, that you do not engage activism until everybody's ready and happy with what needs to be achieved. And also creating a spatial archive that reconfigures public perceptions of neighborhoods, and then just materially creating places that result from this activism. Community kitchens, community gardens. I'm thinking of the Gugulethu can. Gugulethu is one of the oldest former townships in Cape Town. And then also occupational work, that sounds wrong. Sort of occupying places, the sort of in the real kind of late 1960s, early 1970s squatter movement style of occupying vacant public buildings. And this is Ndifuna Ukwazi's work, occupying vacant buildings to kind of focus attention on the housing crisis in the city. So this kind of continuum of I guess what we used to 20 years ago call digital spaces, online spaces, and real spaces, and this kind of mediation that happens in between, I think is actually quite fascinating. So I'm going to end off with 4 themes that I feel encapsulate this work quite nicely, I'd like to think, and could perhaps push us into a space where we can kind of start thinking beyond the smart city. I mean, the one is that I mean, it's something that again comes through over and over again in a lot of the work I've done, and that is the notion of agency. And here, the notion of agency in the remediation of public life is what I want to focus in on. I mean, I think I feel what both these cases represent are instances where the personal is indeed elevated to the political. And I'm mindful of the fact that I'm in the company of some very good feminist scholars. So, and I think that is, I mean, South Africa is a highly, highly politicized country, given that it's a fledgling democracy. But it's interesting how in the day-to-day, these kind of political battles come into the kind of public realm quite obviously and quite distinctively. And also, part of this dynamic is also how the activities of Ndifuna Ukwazi in particular lends legitimacy to the personal through collective storytelling. How the personal experience is framed, and collective personal experiences are framed so that we do understand space differently, and we have greater insights into how the tyrannies of space are sometimes experienced by those operating and living on the margins. And then, of course, the kind of what goes back to social movement theory is how you challenge popular discourse and how you challenge policy discourses through offering what I would like to say in quite a hopeful way, alternative imaginings of what the city could be. Alternative imaginings of cities that are indeed more mindful of all its inhabitants and not those that are able to access housing through the private market. I mean, South Africa does have a public housing program, it's fair to say, but it's not really keeping up with demand, and this is why organizations like Ndifuna or Ukwazi exist. And then what I found exciting initially when I first started working on the Tafelberg case was really about the expanded connections and alliances that were forged through these activities. So I mean, this work is obviously highly political, and it's a small p as well as a big P political. There's a lot of lobbying, there's a lot of kind of interactions that happen between the kind of state and these civil society organizations. But whereas civil society organizations or groups such as, for example, Slum Dwellers International kind of engage the state directly and negotiate with the state, Ndifuna Ukwazi's approach is far more confrontational. And far more sort of in your face, but it's also very strategic. I mean, a large part of their staff are lawyers, constitutional lawyers, and also quite a lot of my graduates end up working for them, so they have a lot of planners working there as well. And there's a kind of technical ability that shines through that kind of confronts the state on its own terms, really. But also enrolls further support beyond its own constituency, again on its own terms. And I think the CAN movement is also very interesting in that regard. One of the interviews that I did with the pioneer of Cape Town together, remarkable woman, where she talked about how interesting it was that people who don't see themselves as activists, people who never saw themselves as being particularly political, became engaged in civic activism at a neighbourhood level in order to start addressing the fallout of the pandemic and the hard lockdown. And then I guess this is the phrase or the conclusion that I feel least secure about, because it appears a bit waffly, values that travel. But I think there's something to be said about that kind of boundedness of negotiated values and sensibilities around civic action, especially given the open-endedness of social media, of course, and some of the kind of noir side affects of the use of social media in particular that we see. That bounded framing through a set of values is actually quite critical and quite essential. And these kind of frames are also holding spaces for discomfort. That is a part of the kind of key strategies of Ndifuna Ukwazi in particular. And then this is something that I sort of explore a lot more thoroughly in the last chapter of my book, and this is around this notion of hybridity and agility, the sort of making and remaking of smart urbanism through appropriation of technologies at a kind of local activist kind of scale, and how the sort of the toolbox is not just digital. The toolbox contains street theatre, traditional kind of marches, court action, what anthropologist Steve Robbins calls the sort of slow activism, but also kind of combined with the use of social media, WhatsApp groups, etc. So this kind of smorgasbord of techniques that gets used and employed towards a kind of overarching narrative doesn't look the same everywhere, and in fact it's not the same at any particular point in time. So there's kind of temporal and spatial influences that have a bearing on how that toolbox reveals itself and the kind of textures of the toolbox and the kind of tools that are employed. And there's an agility that I saw in both cases, sort of responding to a crisis or responding to a problem very quickly and knowing which tools to grab out of the toolbox at which particular moment in time. So, final slide. I mean, in terms of just concluding on this work, my question was really, what does this all mean? What does this mean for the future, kind of moving beyond smart cities? I think what it foregrounds is that political work is important, and it's going to become even more important. I mean, that's a rather bland conclusion, but a rather obvious one. But, you know, if you kind of look at the smart city narrative, it's not terribly politically grounded, is it? And I think the kind of politics that we'll be looking at in future is a kind of finely grained urban politics that I do believe will be more place-based as we kind of become even more sort of adept at location-based media and technologies. And I do believe that the two movements that are outlined here and the techniques employed by these groups appropriate smart technology to reconfigure the city one neighbourhood at a time. They're small moments, but they can be quite dramatic as well. I mean, City of Cape Town has had to relook at its housing policy as partially as a result of this action. And it happens at the speed of trust. It happens when it's ready. So I think if we're going to think about moving beyond smart cities, I don't think that the cities that we're going to be looking at in future as technology is further and further ingrained in the everyday, I don't think they're necessarily going to be terribly comfortable places. And I don't think they can be. I think they could possibly be more authentic or more representative, going back to Maria Kaika's work, that paper and her presentation. But frankly, I think they're more interesting than the smart cities that the kind of corporate narratives that we still encounter, even kind of 7 years down the line, even despite all the critical work that's been done on it. So I'm going to end there, and thank you so much for your attention.